Hey, so I'm going to talk about policies that don't control or curb things, but try to boost something, and that's the fertility rate through housing policies. First, I'm going to talk about the project. It's a larger project. I plan to have several publications out of this. And then I will talk about the state of the art in the literature regarding housing policies targeting families with children. Then I will talk about the ideological background, and then I will move on to discussing trends, long-term trends, and causes of differences. The reason why this topic started to interest me is that there's been recently a surge in housing policies targeting children in many Eastern European countries, Russia, Hungary, Slovakia. And I was just wondering why did that happen, and what were the previous such policies introduced in other countries. When I was reading about European housing history, it popped up quite often in other countries. The goal of my research was to explore the long-term trends and also the causes of differences across countries and also across time. And basically, I used two methods. One was a thorough literature review of the literature in English, but also in national languages. I used deeper translation software for that purpose. And then in a second step, I analyzed legislation regarding such policies and turned that into quantitative data. And so then I could analyze it. It's called lexometric analysis. I had 8 case studies. All the case studies are countries which introduced such policies. So I didn't have case studies which didn't introduce these things. The time range is from 900 and until today. It was funded by the European University Institute in Florence. They enabled me to hire assistants who helped me in identifying the legislation and the relevant parts of that. They were native speakers. So basically, the literature is quite focused on either housing or family policy, but there is not really comparative analysis of housing policies targeting families with children. In housing studies, the most relevant literature is about the financialization, that we have an increase in home ownership, in mortgage home ownership, and a decrease in social housing. A lot of social housing has been privatized, and this rising financialization basically contributes to the increasing role of the family in housing provision. So basically, intergenerational transfers, parents helping their children get housing. So that's another part of the literature. So this family, what role the family plays, is on the increase in Western Europe, but then we also have regional differences in Central and Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. The family plays a larger role than in Western Europe in general. And then the family policy literature focuses on differences between countries. France and Belgium tend to be more pro-natalist, meaning that they support larger families. In Germany, there is less intervention, but it's only increased actually. And in Central and Eastern Europe, we are witnessing a sort of a refamiliarization, meaning that more and more public money is spent on supporting families in general. And this is actually a wider European trend, that we see the retrenchment of the welfare state, but we see increasing spending on family policy. There's the fiscalization of benefits, which means that subsidies are very often tied to taxation. So it's less accessible for people with low income or without employment. And then there is much more focus on gender equality, meaning that there is more support for institutional childcare, but also on incentives for the men to take up caring roles. And then there is less pronatalism in general. Based on the literature review, I found that there were three main ideologies underlying such policies, and the first is I simplified it as nationalism, but it basically like covers many different, slightly different terms, which basically is fueled by the fear of a lower fertility rate than some rival country or some ethnicity or migrants, rival geopolitical blocs. And so then there is this idea that we should increase the fertility rate so that we are not under threat, or we're not gonna vanish from the face of Earth. And then there is this other line of thought which I labeled conservatism. In conservatism, the family plays a very important role in as a unit of welfare redistribution, so protecting its members from the adverse effects of capitalism, but at the same time, it also it limits the state, the welfare state. So we don't need a strong state, but we rather incentivize the family to, or well, help the family to take this role or maintain this role. I will have a separate presentation on it on Monday here in Tarragona if you're around. It was very nice from Sergio that he organized it. Okay, and then egalitarianism also played a role. That's basically mitigating poverty. So the classic aim of housing policy that there were bad housing conditions, unaffordability, unhygienic conditions, and so on and so forth. In the Lexometric database, I basically coded legislation for the type of aids, its loan grant, priority of allocation, some other types, tenure, amount of subsidy, pronatalism, so to what extent, so does the measure prioritize large families, parents eligible for subsidies, like must they be married, or single parents can also be subsidized? Is gender, does gender make a difference? Women are more supported than men. And if there is a means test, meaning that if the measure is targeted to the people with low income. This is an overview on what type of measures we have, which were basically these are the aggregated frequencies. So each unit is a year in one country. So we see that priority in the allocation of non-profit rental housing has been the most popular. Then lump sum subsidies, construction subsidies for home owners, or for housing purchase was the second one. Mortgage subsidies are pretty popular, and then we have some other measures which were less frequent, such as savings premium, that was quite typical of Germany, or tax deduction, again typical of Germany, or the provision of building the land, which is typical of Russia and some other countries for shorter periods of time. We see that in most countries there is a surge either in the interwar period or in the post-war period, and then there is a decrease in the number of measures after the 1970s, more or less. And you see that there is quite a big difference between the number of measures introduced in countries. In Russia, there were not that many, and in Czechoslovakia, Germany, even Hungary, there's quite many of them. It's important to know that I didn't include housing allowances, and that's for the reason that housing allowances in many countries, the role of housing allowances are basically taken by general allowances. So it would have been difficult to account for this difference in the study. If we aggregate it by region, we see that in Western Europe, such policies almost disappeared. And whereas in Eastern Europe, we see that some measures still remained, and there is even a surge in recent years, as I already mentioned. Tenure-wise, home ownership clearly dominates, but at the beginning there was So around the Second World War, there was much more focus on non-profit rental, and this didn't concern only Eastern European countries, which obviously had a large public housing stock, but also some Western countries. Then, as regards the pronatalism aspect of it, we see that it was quite prevalent across regions and across time. Some interesting differences about the means test, meaning that targeting at poor people, that's not as prevalent as pronatalism, but also quite widespread. We see that in Germany, for example, this was less of a thing. Also in Czechia, after the regime change, it was less, and also Bulgaria during state socialism, they were less engaging in means testing. The same is true for Belgium. I was surprised to find out that actually the subsidies were pretty accessible for single parents as well, even in the early periods, in the interwar period, for example. So basically, Czechoslovakia seems to be the only exception where, for a longer time, subsidies were available for married couples. Women weren't really prioritized. In state socialist countries such as Soviet Russia and Czechoslovakia, there were some measures that prioritized women. And this is still, so I'm going to expand on this part. I'm not done with this. This is the, so the amount of the subsidy, how the amount of the subsidy relative to GDP changed over time in US dollars. And we see that, in most countries, they introduced it quite high, and then it decreased. It basically inflated. It was inflated, but then we see that Hungary corrected for this inflation many times, and that's why in Hungary the amount of the subsidy remained higher in the long term than in other countries. But in Czechoslovakia, it started at a quite high level. Okay, and I also started working on the causes of policy choices. This is work in progress. So this is a time series cross-section data, which is not that easy to analyze. And so for that purpose, I use this method called the Driscoll-Crye standard errors regression, fixed effects. The problem with the data was that there is significant autocorrelation of the dependent variable, meaning that there is quite strong path dependence. So the previous value of the variable influences the current value. So for that reason, I included, I employed lagged dependent variable. I included among the independent variables. And then the other problem was that the data are non-stationary, meaning that it's trendy. There is a trend, strong trends in the data. So I was examining differences, how differences changed. And the independent variables I used were the total fertility rate, government position on the left-right scale, GDP per capita, and budget deficit. And so I used those with different dependent variables. Here it's the number of measures. And we see that the number of measures is most impacted by the number of measures in the previous year. So basically the lagged value of the dependent variable. So once a country introduced a number of measures, it stayed that way for a long time. And then there is a very mild effect of the deficit. So the higher the deficit is, the more measures countries introduce. This doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, but I'm going to work a little bit more on that. About means testing, we see that the largest effect that has on means testing is the GDP per capita. So the richer the countries become over time, and the richer they are comparative to each other, they tend to means-test more. There is also an effect of the deficit, which makes a lot of sense, and it's actually in the family policy literature the same link is observed. So countries tend to means-test, but there is deficit, so they limit the number of beneficiaries. Pronatalism basically has the opposite. There is the opposite relationship. So the richer the country is, there is less pronatalism. And this is about home ownership. It's quite similar. So the richer the country is, there is less support for home ownership. And so basically, to conclude, housing aid targeting families virtually disappeared by now in Western Europe, but in Central and Eastern Europe, this decrease happened as well, but this policy didn't disappear completely. And there is a shift towards the exclusive targeting of homeowners in general. Pronatalism is quite prevalent, but egalitarianism is also significant. We basically equal that with the means test. And subsidies have mostly been gender neutral, can be taken by different family types, and GDP seems to be the main driving force behind differences across time and space. So it has a positive impact on means testing, negative impact on human ownership and pronatalism, and there is a much milder effect of ideology, budget deficit, which have an occasional influence. So to wrap it up, the most interesting finding is that policies, so the number of such policies is not driven by the fertility rate, and also the targeting is not driven by the fertility rate. So actually, once such policies are being introduced, then they are influenced by other factors, but they don't really react to the development of the fertility rate over time. So they are not abolished, for example, because of the reason that the fertility rate doesn't decrease that much. Thank you very much for your attention.